Good morning, dear students. Welcome to the online class of science. Children, in the previous chapter, we have studied about force and pressure. And in the types of forces, I have told you that there is contact force, which is of two types, muscular force and frictional force. So, in this chapter, chapter number 12, we will discuss more about the friction and frictional force. Before going to what is friction, I want to ask you a few questions. Children, you might have seen a driver of a car or a truck slowing down the vehicle at a traffic signal. You too slow down your bicycle whenever needed by applying brakes. Have you ever thought why a vehicle slows down when brakes are applied? Not only vehicles, any object moving over the surface of another object slows down when no external force is applied on it. And finally, it stops. Have you not seen a moving ball on the ground stopping after some time? Why do we slip when we step on a banana peel? Why is it difficult to walk on a smooth and wet floor? So, children, you will find the answers to such questions in this chapter. First, let us perform an activity. In this activity, you have to keep a book on a table and you have to gently push it. You observe that it stops after moving for some distance. Repeat this activity pushing the book from the opposite direction. Does the book stop this time too? Yes. The book will stop after some time. That means that the force must be acting on the book, which is opposing its motion. That means the force is acting in the opposite direction of motion. And this force is called the force of friction. If you apply the force along the left, the friction acts along the right direction. If you apply the force along the right direction, the friction acts in the left direction. In both the cases, the force opposes the motion of the book and the force of friction always opposes the applied force. Now let us study what are the factors affecting friction. For this also let us perform an activity. You have to make an inclined plane on a smooth floor on the table. You may use a wooden board supported by your books. Put a mark with a pen at any point A on the inclined plane. Now let a pencil cell move down from this point. How far does it move on the table before coming to rest? Note this distance. Now spread a piece of cloth over the table. Make sure that there are no wrinkles in the cloth. Try the activity again. So, what do you find? What is the distance moved now? Children, you will see that the distance moved in case of the cloth, when the cloth was applied, will be less as compared to the distance when the book was on table. Friction is caused by the irregularities on the two surfaces in contact. I told you that whenever they... So children, in the previous chapter, I already told you that whenever there are two surfaces in contact, the surfaces which are in contact with each other are interlocked. Why do they interlock? They interlock because there are large irregularities in the surfaces which interlock with each other. When we attempt to move any surface, we have to apply a force to overcome the interlocking. On rough surfaces, there are a larger number of irregularities. So the force of friction is greater if a rough surface is involved. That's why you have seen that when the pencil cell was moving on the piece of cloth, because the surface was rough, here the rough surface is there, so the distance moved by the pencil cell was less. Here the less distance is moved. However, in this case, the surface was smooth, so the interlocking was less, hence the distance moved was more. That means the interlocking of the two surfaces will define what will be the force of friction. If the surface is smooth, that means the interlocking will be less, so the friction will also be less. If the surface is rough, then there will be more irregularities, due to which the interlocking will be more, and so the frictional force will also increase. So just now I asked you na, that why you slip on a banana peel. You slip on the banana peel because the banana peel makes the surface smooth in contact, and due to the smooth surface the interlocking will be less, and hence you fall down. Similarly, when you move on a floor which has some water spilled over it, because of the water layer the surface becomes smooth, so the interlocking between the shoes and the ground will be less, because in between there is a water layer, and water layer makes it smooth, so you tend to fall down. So children, what is friction? Friction is a force that comes into play when two surfaces come in contact with each other. The frictional force or the force of friction acts in the opposite direction of the motion of the object, and the force of friction opposes the relative motion between the surfaces of two moving objects. Since it opposes the motion, that's why a moving ball comes to rest after moving a certain distance. Now, what are the factors that can affect friction? The first factor is the irregularities of a surface. If we move an object which has an irregular or rough surface on another surface which is also irregular, the force of friction will be high in this case, and the movement of the object would be restricted. Restricted means it will not move faster. The regularity of a surface or its smoothness. If the surface of the objects are smooth, the force of friction would be less, because the interlocking between the irregularities will be less, and the object would move easily over the surface. Even smooth surfaces have a certain irregularity. And the third factor is, if two surfaces are pressed hard, the force of friction increases between two surfaces if they are pressed hard, and hence the movement of object becomes restricted. However, if there is no pressure, the object can easily move. Now we come on the types of friction. There are four types of friction: the static friction, the sliding friction, the rolling friction, and the fluid friction. This is the fourth one, the fluid friction. So we will discuss these four friction one by one. The first one is static friction. The frictional force that comes into play until an object starts moving is called static friction. Children, static word means at rest. This static means at rest. So at rest means it is not moving. So the friction which is between the objects when they are not moving, when they are still. That is known as static friction. Second is the sliding friction. Sliding friction comes into play whenever an object moves along the surface of another object. And the sliding friction is the force that opposes the movement or slide of the object. Then rolling friction. When an object is rolling on the surface, that time it is rolling friction. And the fourth one is fluid friction. What are fluids, children? Fluids are water, that means all the liquids are fluids, and air. These are fluids. So the friction which occurs due to the movement of the liquids or the movement of the air is known as fluid friction. So what is fluid friction? When an object moves in a fluid, the fluid exerts a fluid friction upon the object. It is also called air friction, which when the medium of travel is air, and viscous friction when the medium of travel is water. Now let's see the advantages of frictional force. Frictional force is necessary for various purposes in our daily lives, such as number 1, it allows us to walk on the earth surface. Second, it allows us to write with a pen or on a surface or on a paper or on the blackboard, etc. It allows us to fix a nail in the wall. The moving object would never be able to come to the state of rest without the frictional force. That means if the frictional force is not there, then a moving ball will always move. It will never come to rest. Similarly, if the brakes which are applied does not produce a frictional force, then the bicycle or the car or any vehicle will never stop. It will keep on moving. Then other advantages, it would not be possible to drive any automobiles on the road without the frictional force. It would not be possible to construct any buildings without the frictional force. Also, frictional force uses in striking a matchstick, in the spikes of the cricket players or the football players, the spike shoes are there, which helps them to stick to the ground and they do not fall, because these spikes makes the surface rough and the interlocking with the ground becomes more. Hence, while running and while kicking, the players does not fall. Then writing on paper and driving automobiles. In all these cases, the frictional force is advantageous. Now come to the disadvantages of frictional force. Frictional force results in wear and tear of the objects, such as the moving parts of the machines, the tires of a vehicle, the sole of the shoes, etc. Children, wear and tear means after some time you see that the surface becomes rough, or you will see that the parts are coming out from the machines due to the frictional force. So this is the loss in the quality of the machine is known as wear and tear. They break or they become rough or some parts are damaged, that is known as wear and tear due to frictional force. Second is it results in the production of heat in the case of machines, and this production of heat leads to wastage of energy. Third one, frictional force leads to decrease in the speed of a moving object or sometimes stops it. And the fourth one, it can lead to noise pollution in certain cases. For instance, aircrafts produce loud sound due to the resistance of the air. When a blowing air is there in the opposite direction, if you are moving and the blowing air is coming from front, then you have to apply more force to drive your bicycle. Then wear and tear of the materials is there, and causes noise pollution and causes fires in forests. How it produces heat? This simple phenomenon you can see by simply rubbing your arms. You take your arms and rub against each other. Okay? When you rub them, you will find that the heat is generated. That means the friction produces heat also. Now, let's study more by seeing the example or the activity regarding the static friction and the sliding friction by the video. So children, let us move a box at rest. We find that it is little tough to get it started in motion. So the force required to overcome the friction at the instant an object starts moving from the rest is a measure of static friction. Let us move a car now which is already in motion. The force which is required to keep the object moving with the same speed is a measure of sliding friction. When the car starts sliding, the contact points on its surface do not get enough time to lock into the contact points on the floor. So the sliding friction is slightly smaller than the static friction, and you find it somewhat easier to move the box already in motion than to get it started. That means static friction is greater and sliding friction is little less. Static friction is greater. Why? Because when the object is at rest, it gets more time to interlock with the irregularities of the surfaces in contact. So when the interlocking is more, friction becomes more. However, when the object is already moving, that time the two surfaces did not get enough time to interlock the irregularities amongst each other. So they constantly keep on moving. So the surface do not get time to interlock. That's why the sliding friction is less. So it means static friction is greater than sliding friction. Now, when we fix a nail on a wall, this is due to friction. If an object started moving, it would never stop if there was no friction. There had been no friction between the tires of the automobiles and the road, they could not be started or stopped or turned to change the direction of the motion. Without friction, no building could be constructed. On the other hand, friction is an evil. It wears out the materials, whether they are screws, ball bearings or soles of the shoes. You must have seen worn out steps or foot over bridges at railway stations. Friction can also produce heat. Vigorously rub your palms together for a few minutes. It will make you feel warm. When you strike a matchstick against the rough surface, it catches fire. You might have observed that the jar of a mixer becomes hot when it is run for a few minutes. So, the machines, when they are operated, again there is friction due to which heat is generated, which causes wastage of energy. We shall discuss the ways of minimizing friction in our next class. So children, today we have studied that friction opposes the relative motion between the two surfaces in contact. Static friction comes into play when we try to move an object at rest. Sliding friction comes into play when the object is sliding over another object. And sliding friction is smaller than static friction. That is all in the topic for today.